Good morning, afternoon, and evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for the 8th Post 2020 webinar, the last one for 2019, which was indeed a very busy year. And we are really glad that you can join us for this last session and closing of the year in style. Apologies for the late start. We've run into some technical difficulties, but we are now back on board, and I hope everybody is able to hear me. Ryan Fisher, I'm a professional officer in the city's Biodiversity Center at ICLEI, based in the ICLEI Africa office. And today's session essentially is a report back on the SAPSTA 23. SAPSTA meaning the subsidiary board on scientific, technical and technological advice. And yeah, today is just a little bit of feedback on SAPSTA and one or two other events that happened in the months past. Joined by my senior manager, Ms. Ingrid Kutsia. She will be presenting on some SAPSTA feedback as well in terms of local and sub-national participation. And then we also have Ms. Wendy Yap from the Singapore National Parks Board, who's going to share with us some reflections on Maya Planter's roundtable. Just to mention that today's webinar sessions are split into two. So this is the morning session, and we'll have another one this afternoon at 3 South African time, by which time we'll then be joined by Mr. Oliver Hilal and Ms. Larissa Heinisch, and then not Ms. Wendy Yap. So obviously due to our global reach, we have to split these in two and take people's time zones into account. But where these colleagues or panelists are not present, for example, this morning in the case of Mr. Oliver and Ms. Larissa, Ingrid Kutsia will just give some feedback and present on their behalf. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us. Just some housekeeping rules before we start. We're going to have the full presentation, so 4 presentations, after which time we'll have an opportunity for questions and discussions. And if you feel, please feel free to ask a question at any time post the presentations. And there's essentially 2 ways that you can do that. The one is that you can raise your hand, and you will be able to do that under the attendees tab. You will see the 4th column, there's a raised hand option, so you're welcome to do that. Other option is you're also welcome to use the questions and chat functions to ask any questions of clarity, etc. Just a reminder again, if you're unable to hear me, please just indicate so perhaps to the chat function, and we will see if we can sort it out from this side. So thank you once again, and without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to just before we get there, just a reminder that the webinar will be recorded, and the recording and presentations will be made available to all participants post the webinar. So thanks again, and without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ingrid Kutsia.
Thank you very much. And just to say that I will be presenting on behalf of Oliver this morning. And if you can just take me to that next slide, thank you. All right, so Oliver is going to talk about just a quick feedback on SAPSTA. And basically the things that he is mentioning is the focus that there was on climate change and biodiversity. Another interesting one this time was a lot of talk on nature and culture and the linkages between them, which is also important from a local and subnational perspective. In ecological and biologically sensitive marine areas was also prominent, as well as the issue of technical and scientific cooperation and wildlife management. Now, in the beginning of SAPSTA, there was a presentation by the co-chairs on the essential elements of the global biodiversity framework. And these raised, for example, these addressed the goals of 2030 as well as 2050, particularly pointing on responsibility and transparency, It talks to the issue of how to deal with tools and solutions, how to reduce threats. There was a lot of discussion around whether it should only be the direct drivers or indirect drivers of biodiversity. A lot of emphasis on meeting people's needs. Very discussion around the means of implementation and the enabling conditions. And it caused for a lot of lively debate in the sessions at SAPSTA. And then the other thing that, just to mention quickly, is that the co-chair also mentioned that
Sorry, Ingrid, it's Miguel from Capacity Center from ICLEI. Could you share your screen because we cannot see anything?
Oh,
So
okay.
please share your screen.
Sorry.
Okay,
Sorry
sorry,
about
folks,
that,
we're just
Miguel.
being asked to share the screen.
Yeah.
Can you see it now? It seems that there, just go back there to that one. Show screen. It should come up now.
Now it's coming up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh.
sorry about that.
No, well, you're welcome. No worries.
Okay. So just to say that the other thing that was important coming from the co-chairs at SAPSTA is they are working on the zero draft of the new global biodiversity framework, and this is going to be disseminated before February next year when the second open-ended working group meeting is taking place in China. We seem to have more technical problems. The slides don't want to move. I'm going to keep talking because we've already lost a lot of time, and then hopefully we will solve this, the technicians will solve that problem. The other thing that was raised at SAPSTA was the long-term approach to mainstreaming. And the focus there is on incorporating vertical harmonization of policies and programs, including the work that's done at the level of cities and subnational governments. And just to mention also that it will be shared in time for the Kunming meeting as well. There is also a Global Biodiversity Outlook, number 5, which was released for comment. The comment period ends on the 6th of January, so anybody who's interested will find it on the CBD website, and there's an online system for making comments. And the important thing to note there is that there is a chapter on cities. And then I think sort of the overall message, certainly for me, coming from the SAPSTA, was that the linkage between climate change, the deterioration of nature, and achieving a good quality of life for all is interconnected and therefore needs to be addressed synergistically. And the really sort of gratifying thing was the recognition that this needs to happen from local to global levels. The last slide, I am going to move over into the next presentation, which will be my own, and I am just going to talk very quickly about the side events that we held at SAPSTA and a few other events. There were 2 side events that we participated in. The first one was held on the 26th of November in the evening, and it was co-hosted by ICLEI, Regions 4, the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, as well as the group on leading subnational governments towards the Aichi biodiversity targets. The focus of this particular side event was on using nature-based solutions to address biodiversity and climate challenges at the local and subnational levels. It was a very well-attended and very lively side event, which was moderated by Didier Babin from Expertise France. Oliver Hillel presented the opening address, and the It's consisted of 2 sections, a very quick session on panel presentations, and I've listed them there. You can see what they were, quite a wide variety. And essentially these were local and subnational government representatives and political representatives talking about the innovations that they had come up with in their own particular areas. And then what happened after that in the there was a facilitated discussion where Didier set certain questions to the various parties represented in the side event. Some of the sort of key outcomes and discussions and issues that came up were that obviously the different innovations, which are sort of in many respects globally or geographically representative, and then the importance of the contribution of local and subnational governments at the level of implementation. The co-chair who attended it also made the point that the lower levels of government could integrate at the NBSAPs, and this would be very important for the new global biodiversity framework. And then just to end it off with, I think, a very significant comment that Wendy made and in her contribution at the side event around how in Singapore biodiversity and nature are as important as infrastructure in urban governance, which actually led to a lot of interesting discussions. One of the other side events was on science and policy messages for transformative change. This was organized by Expertise France, and it was a very big side event. It had very eminent people attending, providing their different perspectives. So, for example, there was a perspective from IPBES, 2 from parties, being Finland and Japan, 1 from the IDDR, and then myself from ICLEI talking about the local and subnational impacts of science and policy. And I think the message that came out of the discussions afterwards was that we need to improve our understanding of diversity policies are implemented at local level, and that there are already some good solutions and methodologies that could be scaled up. Then just very quickly, there was a communications experts workshop, which was organized by the CBD, which was held slightly 2 days before SAPSTA. There will be a notification coming out shortly on the post-2020 communication strategies and messaging. And this is involving a whole range of organizations such as ICLEI, WWF, UNEP, World Bank, etc. Next slide. And then just to lead into Wendy's presentation, which is going to be following now, we had Maya Plant, who's the ICLEI Global Ambassador for the local biodiversity. She organized a roundtable and she invited several parties to the City Hall, where on the 26th of November, where they focused on the role and contribution of, again, local and subnational governments. ICLEI introduced the draft 10-point framework, and the idea was to hear parties' views and get feedback from parties. We were very fortunate in that although the roundtable was held concurrently to a very important session at SAPSTA, we managed to get 7 parties attending the event, and both of the co-chairs of the open-ended working group, and of course local representatives from the City of Montreal, as well as from the Basque County and Quebec province. One of the outcomes from that meeting was that we floated the idea of establishing a Friends of Cities and Subnational Governments for future engagement between parties and the lower levels of government at CBD, COP and SAPSTA events. And then just the other important thing to mention is that the mayor also made mention of the endorsement of the role that ICLEI plays within the global task force of local and regional governments, where we are the focal point for engaging with the CBD, the UNFCCC, and the Disaster Management Convention. And I think with that, we will hand over to Wendy Yap of Singapore National Parks to get her presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, everyone. I participated in this roundtable. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, Wendy.
Okay, good. I think it was a very valuable roundtable that was organized by the Mayor of Montreal, primarily because we had the full attention of both the OEWG chairs that were there full-time. And I think we highlighted the role that cities could potentially contribute in terms of the global post-2020 framework. And as mentioned by Ingrid, she highlighted the ICLEI 10-point framework, and I think that was well delivered. But we wanted to actually explore with the two OEWG chairs on what possibility could cities contribute, and there were some discussions on how we can contribute to the discussions. I think they are very keen for cities to take part in it, but I think it's now dependent on the modalities and how we come up with maybe bold declarations to commit cities to implementing the post-2020 framework, or we have to come up with some textual proposals when we see the draft coming up for OEWG2 on how we can integrate cities' contribution to the post-2020 framework. I think there was also appreciation to the Scottish government who are organizing, who will be organizing a thematic workshop in April on subnational and regional governments, and this gives us another opportunity to explore how cities and subnational governments can contribute to the post-2020 framework. At this point, I also like to highlight that Singapore, we basically had a workshop in October 2019 this year to review the City Biodiversity Index, or also known as the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity, which could potentially be a tool to help cities demonstrate their commitment to the post-2020 framework. So the workshop in October actually reviewed the existing suite of 23 indicators and also explored potentially 7 new indicators to be included, which actually will highlight the developments in the last 10 years, primarily on habitat restoration, biodiversity and health, nature-based solutions, vertical greenery, citizen science, natural capital assessments. So since these are some of the new indicators that are being discussed, and then about 3 indicators have been dropped from the old one. We are planning to actually have the revised set of indicators. We aim to have it sometime in March 2020, and we hope to circulate this to all interested parties. So if you're interested to know more about this, do write to me and I can send you the current discussions, and you can also provide your feedback. So back to Mayor Planter's roundtable, I'd just like to say that it was a great opportunity to have the full attention of the 2 OEWG chairs, and I think they recognize the city's contribution. Now is for us to act and to see how we can actually concretely put cities' contribution into the post-2020 global framework. I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Colleagues, just a reminder that we'll have a question and answer session after all the presentations. So we're going into the last presentation now that Ingrid will do on Larissa Heinish's behalf.
Thank you, Ryan. So Larissa is reporting back on a workshop that took place earlier in November. It was held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, from the 4th to the 5th of November. And it was essentially organized by the SCPD, and it was it's what they call a preparatory workshop on local approaches to ecosystems and restoration governance. And I think the important part of this is that it sort of fell also within the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration, and then it was supported also by the EU, the Post-2020 EU Support Project, which is being implemented by Expertise France. Next slide. So the objective of this particular workshop was to showcase the contribution of local actors, as well as the private sector and non-state actors with regards to restoration initiatives, and to provide inspirational material on restoration governance for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So it's also part of the discussions and debates around the new global biodiversity framework at the moment. And it was very well attended. There were some 100 participants, as well as 15 panelists. And the attendees included, and panelists included, people from ICLEI, as well as from the International Institute of Sustainability, UN, SCBD representatives. There were European Union delegation representatives from the delegation to Brazil, the World Resources Institute, European Commission, and many more. Next slide. And it consisted of 5 sessions. And in the first session, as you can see from the program, they talked about what are the ambitions of these various actors, both the local actors as well as the private sector and non-state actors in respect of ecosystem restoration for the new global biodiversity framework. And then they looked very specifically in the second section on what it is that local and subnational governments are already contributing to ecosystem restoration. And then there was a session that focused specifically on the private sector's contribution. Lastly, the non-sector actors' contributions was also presented. And in the final session of the workshop, they looked at sort of policy proposals around ecosystem restoration governance. This was divided into smaller groups. If you go into the next slide, I just want to highlight some of the key findings. And essentially, there are 11 sort of main findings. The first one being that the local actors, both within government and outside of government, play an instrumental role in implementing ecosystem restoration, and they thus need to be empowered. The second thing is that there needs to be a balance between biodiversity conservation on the one hand and the provision of ecosystem services to maintain human well-being on the other hand, and this needs to be taken into account in terms of governance. The third thing is that ecosystem restoration aims to restore biodiversity in the whole range of ecosystem functions and services, and they should then one should then obviously promote approaches that are focused on such as rewilding, open-ended restoration, etc. The sort of fourth finding was that it is vital for addressing climate change, as well as job creation, poverty alleviation, and can provide business opportunities if properly managed. In other words, it's taking us beyond the realm of just biodiversity, and that's very important given the current crises and focuses or challenges that we're facing in the world. In the fifth place, one of the findings was that in order for that there are already national policies in place, and that what is important is that there's a restoration programs need to be established to reduce the percentage of degradation of already degraded ecosystems, and that if one can collectively have successful implementation of such policies, there will be a net positive impact for ecosystems. The issue of resource mobilization was also raised, and the important point I think there is that it should have a bottom-up approach to ensure that there's ownership and participative sort of engagement as well. And that also in relation to resource mobilization, it's necessary to assign funds for restoration that is specifically focused on capacity building, education, communication, and promoting wider to society how important ecosystem services and ecosystem restoration is for societal well-being. The question on targets also came up, and it was felt that these should be measured in terms of ecosystem conditions, pressures as well as direct and indirect drivers when one talks about ecosystem restoration. And linked to that is the question of effective monitoring has to be guaranteed, and that we need resources for that as well as access to data. And then for specifically when one talks about the indigenous peoples and local communities where they live, there needs to be free and prior informed consent, and that the indigenous peoples and local communities should be part of restoration efforts, building on their traditional knowledge and innovations and practices, recognizing this as an important factor. And then finally, that ecosystem restoration takes place and should take place both in urban and rural areas, but given obviously consideration to the specificities of those particular areas. So it was a very rich and very a lot of technical discussion with some very important findings that obviously get fed into the wider global biodiversity framework process. And these are just some links and resources that were tabled at that conference that are available if people are more interested in more information. And that is the end of that presentation.
Thank you very much, Ingrid, and also big thanks to Wendy, Ingrid specifically for standing in for Oliver and Larissa. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the formal presentations. I think we can now open the floor for any questions that you might have. You're welcome to address them to any one of the speakers, general comments. You guys are all welcome. So if you have a specific question, you are welcome to raise your hand or use the chat or question tabs. Okay. If there are no questions or comments, just a reminder that this session will be recorded. The presentations will be made available to you. And we have another session this afternoon at 3 South Africa time. So I think with that, a big thank you also to Wendy for availing yourself and joining us for the session. We really appreciate it. And I think with that, we can close the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.